Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
Making Minnesota's prisons safer becomes a high priority for state lawmakers. We talk with the new Corrections Commissioner and the Senate's Public Safety Chair about efforts underway to hire more prison guards and other top public safety efforts. Stay tuned for this and more on this week's Capitol Report. Welcome to this week's program. I'm Shannon Loehrke. Throughout the summer and fall months, we're inviting heads of state agencies to provide insight on the changes made during the 2019 legislative session and the challenges that still need to be addressed. Joining me now is Commissioner Paul Schnell of the Department of Corrections. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Shortly after your appointment as Commissioner, you came on the program and talked about the challenges facing your department. First and foremost was the need for more staff. This budget includes money for 67 new corrections officers over the next 2 years. So how important is this new funding?
Well, this is critical. I mean, remember that the staff really come as a part of a broader need to have better safety and security within our prisons for both the sake of staff as well as for those that we incarcerate there. And so these staff will be really critical. We had hoped, and the initial ask was for 120, but this will be a great start toward allowing us to better staff those areas where we think risk is greatest.
And I also read that there are many open positions just due to retirements and job changes. So there's a big hiring push going on for the Department of Corrections. How does the tight labor market play into this? Are there enough interested and qualified candidates? And do candidates need experience?
Yeah, I think this is I mean, it's a great question, and I think it's an important one. The labor market is affecting all of us, and I think in corrections we're mindful of the fact that we need to draw people who really want to help serve their fellow Minnesotans in this critical and important role that ultimately helps turn around the lives of some of the people that are involved in the criminal justice system, that ultimately we hope will become proactive and engaged, fully engaged members of our communities. So we're looking for those, and those people are out there, we believe. We are thinking differently about how we attract people to this job. There are many benefits to working for the DOC and these really tough public safety jobs. At the same time, I think the rewards are tremendous. We do believe that there are people out there, but we are also recognize that we need to be creative.
What does your ideal candidate look like?
Our ideal candidate really, at the end of the day, looks like you. It looks like anyone who I think has a heart to say there is a possibility that people can change their lives. There is a need to provide stability and order. And with people who have that sense, the ability to do that, and we provide training for all of that, this is an incredible career that can provide, I think, amazing experiences, as well as you have the chance to change people's lives, which is really an incredible reward.
An ombudsman for the Department of Corrections was established in 1972, but its budget was zeroed out in 2003. The legislature has now allocated funds to reestablish the position. So what does the position of an ombudsman for the Department of Corrections mean for both the staff and the inmates?
Well, the ombudsman becomes a role that is independent. They are a third party, so they report directly to the governor, and a family member or somebody who's incarcerated, either in the Department of Corrections or in any of our county jails, can use the ombudsman as a place to lodge a complaint and have that complaint looked into or addressed. The benefit of ombudsmen, even for places like the Department of Corrections or even sheriff's offices, is it can become a third party to take a look at, are there things practices that should be done differently, or should we resource an area or a need differently? And so that's one of the places where the ombudsman can actually be a benefit to our staff, as well as to the people who are incarcerated, whether it's in the Department of Corrections or, as I said, in any of Minnesota's 87 county jails.
So it's an independent, essentially, set of eyes that can look at a situation and maybe provide clearer judgment.
Absolutely. They have full authority to look into, investigate, and address complaints. And oftentimes, they may look into a complaint and find that that the services were delivered just as they should have been and appropriately, and that's also a benefit to departments. But I think it does provide needed relief for people who are incarcerated to have that independent ear to look into these issues.
Last week, Governor Walz signed into law reforms pertaining to the use of solitary confinement, which can adversely affect the mental health of inmates in prison. Until now, Minnesota has had no laws specifically addressing the use of this practice. So what is this change and why is it important?
Well, I mean, we know, segregation is really, for lack of a better word, it becomes a way of addressing conduct within a prison system, which itself is intended to address inappropriate or unlawful conduct. So that's one of the mechanisms that we use to control behavior within the facilities. And really what this does is it created certain check-in mechanisms and reporting mechanisms so that people can't be allowed to fester, so to speak, inside restrictive housing or segregation. That mental health people have to do check-ins. There's documentation of that. A plan to get people back to general population is developed. And it includes reporting both to me from the staff at our correctional facilities, and then ultimately our department reporting to the legislature in terms of what progress we're making around addressing this. So these reforms really were about kind of setting structure and that we think will ultimately result in better services to people who are incarcerated.
Recently, a decision was made to redistribute wardens throughout the state. So 5 wardens will transfer to new facilities from where they have been, and 2 associate wardens will be promoted. This is a lot of change. What is the impetus for this?
Well, I think one of the things, again, you come in from the outside and you start to say, look, we have incredible wardens and we have, amazing experiences. And yet what can oftentimes happen is we don't cross-germinate well. And really what is the intention and what has been the history and what is done in many states around the country is that wardens on maybe it's 3-5 years, there's going to be some movement. And so that the experiences that they have, the leadership things that skills that they bring can really affect that new facility. And it's a fresh set of eyes on what's happening operationally. And we think this is really important to develop our leadership, not just of those wardens, but of the people that they lead. And so we think this is just an incredible opportunity and an important one. And I think sets in place really what we think is important to developing leadership into the future.
Well, and you came in with a fresh set of eyes, and now you're sort of transferring that around the state. In recent years, there's been talk of building more prisons or expanding prisons due to the increasing size of the incarcerated population. Where are we now in terms of our prison population in Minnesota?
We're at capacity. And I think this is a key and critical juncture for our state. And I think we're going to see this coming in, developing, and conversations happening, beginning this summer and into the next legislative session. What is our goal? Do we want to build more capacity and build more prisons, which we know are costly and challenging? Or are there ways that we can manage people who offended in our communities effectively without impacting public safety? And I think these are the questions that we're going to be struggling with as a state, as states are across the country. And even the federal government has given a lot more attention to this very issue. Correctional incarceration is costly, and we have to be mindful of that.
Very expensive, yes. Commissioner Schnell, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Following the 2019 legislative session, Senator Warren Limmer, chair of the Judiciary and Public Safety Committee, said, "We have successfully funded our courts, prisons, and law enforcement and taken additional steps to reform broken programs for victims who are often forgotten." He joins me now to elaborate. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm glad to be here.
Let's start with your quote. Who are the victims who are often forgotten?
I believe that the victims that we're talking about are those who are sexual assault victims throughout the state. We have heard plenty of stories about women who feel that they have been neglected in criminal investigations. When they've pointed out to the abuser or the rapist by name, They point to the person where they live, and over a number of years, police have not fulfilled their full investigation duties. And in addition to that, there's a historic story that's emerging for the past year and a half, and that's about a historical record with murdered and missing Indigenous women. Women who are part of our Indian communities, our Native American communities. They feel also that the investigations of women who have been murdered or just plain have disappeared over the last 30, 40 years have not been investigated as well.
So let's talk briefly about the sexual assault task force. The legislature is creating this task force that's going to look into the problem that you outlined that was brought forth by a Star Tribune series that showed, I think, almost 25% of sexual assault cases victims feel are not handled appropriately. What kind of reforms do you think this sexual assault task force might highlight?
Well, I think first, law enforcement will tell you and prosecutors will tell you these cases are very difficult to prosecute. Oftentimes there is not evidence. Oftentimes there is not a recollection exactly of what occurred or who did it. Oftentimes alcohol is involved. Then you have the stigma of bringing a victim through a court system and then getting pummeled by a defense bar. Very difficult, but at the same time, I have to ask the question, is there any other area of crime that has a 25% failure to prosecute? And especially in this type of crime, this intimate assault on someone's body as well as emotions, 25% is unacceptable. And so we started to look at where the police responsibilities have begun and where they have failed. Or is there a pattern of behavior that just is assumed by perhaps a line officer at the time of taking down notes and they fail to move it on to a prosecutor's office? These are all issues that need to be questioned. We began that questioning, but we thought that a task force might be necessary. Bring in victims, bring in prosecutors, bring in law enforcement, bring in the defense bar, and make sure that we're adequately doing our responsible job for anyone who is a victim on this type of brutal crime.
And you also mentioned the missing and murdered Indigenous women. There's a task force now to look at that. You called the stories that you heard during public testimony overwhelming. What do you hope will result here?
Well, I think we need to expose some sunlight to this whole issue. It seems like it's been in the shadows for many, many years. A lot of these Indian tribal communities are in distant locations. They're outstate. They don't have a large law enforcement contingency around these areas. Is that the problem? Is it a failure of resources? Is it a failure of will? And I think that has to be known. When I first started learning about this about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I was rather amazed that there are missing women, there are murdered women, there are children that are also victims, and they just kind of disappear. And law enforcement doesn't seem to have a lot of, well, if you listen to the victims' families, they will say that law enforcement doesn't have a sincere desire to pursue an investigation. That cannot happen in this state. We are not going to allow that. The task force, I'm hoping, will bring a little more sunshine to this issue. And then we can respond even further.
Let's turn to the new positions for the Department of Corrections. It's been known for a while that there's staffing needs there. There's funding for 67 new guard positions, but there's almost as many vacancies due to retirements, promotions, and job changes. As a former corrections officer, what's your pitch to people who might be interested in this line of work, especially considering our tight job market?
Well, there's a lot of people that want to go into criminal justice jobs, whether it's law enforcement, corrections, perhaps it's into probation work. You really get a good grounding when you start working and walking a cell block with, let's say, 150 male felons, with you as being the one and only correction officer overseeing that that type of community. You really learn about politics there. And you also learn a lot about diplomacy. The job, if you want to be safer on the job, be diplomatic. Build a relationship. It's not you versus them. You're both in the same box and you have to make everything work. But it also is a great resume builder if someone wanted to build that into that law enforcement direction, or in criminology, or perhaps someone wants to get some real life experience, get an added degree and you can become an adjunct professor fairly easily, or go on even further for a full doctorate. Lots of opportunities can come from that, and their pay is going up, and there's openings. So if you have any background at all or interest in law enforcement, criminology, corrections, now's the time to pursue it.
Good time to enter that career pathway. There were other important policy changes that had to do with sex crimes in this bill. Can you outline just a few of them?
Well, I actually wrote them down. We focused on sexual assault investigations, sexual conduct crimes, as well as predatory offender registration. We increased some sentencing for child pornographers. We created an enhanced penalty for surreptitious intrusion, meaning kind of like a peeping Tom, but involving a minor with sexual intent. There's some really crazy people out there, and sometimes their desire to view a young child through a window creates more of a desire, and oftentimes it evolves into a physical attack. And we want to make sure that if that type of activity is going on, we want to react to that quick before it develops into something else later on. And we didn't have any type of law that addressed that type of issue. We expanded the definition of position of authority. Position of authority is best described by an example. If you're a teacher with a young child, you have an assumed position of authority. Later on, when it's an adult versus a teenage girl in high school, that position of authority can still be rather powerful in a relationship. And we did have that position of authority go beyond or up to 90 days. It was to cover a school summer vacation, so that that individual adult could not use that position of authority for 90 days. We discovered that in some school districts, a school break goes beyond 90 days. So we went to 120 to make sure that we have that clear. And we also prohibited peace officers from engaging in any type of sexual conduct while an individual is in their custody. You may have heard about the buttocks bill.
Yes, the
famous.
butt bill. Yes.
Senator Marty brought that forward, and as well as Senator Lane. That is, mores are changing, and what might have been considered a swat on the butt by a coach to get a kid out to the playing field is now considered a little bit more of a taboo, and we're responding to that as well. Just don't do it.
Just don't
Pat
do
him
it.
on the head, slap him on the back.
There you go.
Keep everything above the
There you
waist.
go. Senator Limmer, it was a very productive session, and I look forward to having you back as we prepare for the next one in February. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Each year, state fairgoers are asked to take an opinion poll on pressing state issues. Questions are developed from among the numerous bills proposed by lawmakers and represent issues and concerns that remain unresolved. You'll find the Minnesota Senate booth and the House of Representatives booth inside the Education Building on Cosgrove Street at the State Fairgrounds. In addition to making your views known by taking the separate polls offered by the Senate and the House, you may have the opportunity to visit with one or more lawmakers frequently on hand to listen to the concerns of fairgoers. The Education Building also houses booths of some of Minnesota's nonprofit and educational institutions, offers robotics demonstrations by middle and high school students, and displays art, writing, and craft projects demonstrating the work of some of Minnesota's most talented kids. If you happen to find yourself at the Great Minnesota Get-Together this summer, Don't forget to stop by the Minnesota Senate booth in the Education Building to provide your perspective on this year's State Fair Opinion Poll. Historian Brian Pease describes one of the Capitol's unique features in our occasional series, The People's House. Capitol architect Cass Gilbert designed the second floor of the Capitol Rotunda with 4 alcoves to be filled at a later date, and they have been filled with statues of Civil War heroes. Can you tell us about the first one that comes to mind?
One very prominent statue you'll see in the second floor is William Colville, who was a colonel from the 1st Minnesota Infantry. And his role, his claim to fame, was leading the men of the 1st Minnesota at the charge at Gettysburg, where they lost 82% of their men. He was wounded twice there, and so it was one of those things that he survived those wounds, became one of the renowned war heroes of Minnesota, and became an attorney general after the war. He also served in the House of Representatives. He was like a land commissioner up in northeastern Minnesota, and so there's a little township, or a little town, Colville it's called, and that's part of his legacy. But he lived in Red Wing, so that's where he was coming to St. Paul, Minneapolis and St. Paul, for the big Grand Day celebration of the flags being moved from the second Capitol to the brand new Capitol. So he was going to be one of the guests of honor. And he was staying at the Veterans Home in Minneapolis, which was not uncommon for veterans to find a place to stay when they're in the Twin Cities. And he passed away in his sleep 2 days before that big event took place.
And he was the first to be laid in state in the state capitol.
That's correct. He was the first person, Minnesotan, to be laid in state in the Capitol, and it was a very poignant part of that remembrance of the the flag bearers and the Civil War veterans and those flags being brought to the Capitol. But his body was in state, right in the center of the rotunda, and so those flag bearers, as they marched into the building, marched by his casket as part of that final tribute to this great war hero.
Alexander Wilkin, why was he here, and why is he the only one of the 4 statues to have the tree stump with the oak leaves next to him?
Yeah, he was one of the highest ranking officers from the state of Minnesota to be killed in the Civil War. So the symbolism of that cut down oak tree is that's in cemeteries, or it's often referring to a man who was cut down in his prime. Just like the strong oak is cut down, you have this loss, this, tremendous strength and authority that's disappeared because of that death. Alexander Wilkin was from St. Paul, an attorney. He was a U.S. Marshal here. He also was one of the first secretaries of the territory from the early 1850s, 1851 to 1853. And so he had established himself here as a pretty strong St. Paul resident, was a landowner and so forth. He started an insurance company that eventually became Travelers
yes.
Insurance Company
Yes.
today. And so he's the father and the creator of that big corporation. And then you also have Wilkin County was named in honor of him to remember his Civil War sacrifice as a Minnesotan in that war.
John Sanborn both began his career and ended his career in state politics, first as a member of the House and Senate. He was one of the first legislators to write the laws for the state, and then went back into politics at the end of his career and fought in the Civil War in between. Talk more about John Sanborn.
Yeah, he was a pretty interesting person in St. Paul's history. He was a lawyer, had a pretty strong established firm. He, in fact, had already, by the time of the Civil War, had addressed the Supreme Court in 4 different cases. So people were asking him for his services. He became a state senator. When the war began, was given the responsibility to be the adjutant general. So it was his job to organize all of the Minnesota units that were going to be sent out to fight in the Civil War. So he raised the first 4 infantry regiments. He put a couple of artillery units together, cavalry units. So there were 11 units that he had helped get armed, equipped, trained at Fort Snelling to send out to fight. And eventually, because of his role in doing that, he was given the colonelcy, or becoming the leader, the commander of the 4th Minnesota Infantry.
I read that he was well respected by many tribal leaders. They called him Black Whiskers, and along with Kit Carson, he was responsible for negotiating some treaties. Is that correct?
Yeah. They were some peace councils and some treaties that he was a part of in the 1860s, 1867 and 68. So he served in the military after the Civil War for several years. And what's remarkable about him is he was, as we mentioned, a state senator and a House member and a pretty well-known attorney in the city. But if you go to his grave in Oakland Cemetery in St. Paul, you'll see in this big monument of his, it's General Sanborn. So I think that was something he was very proud of throughout his life, serving in the Civil War. He served before he died as the president of the Minnesota Historical Society. We have a lot of his Civil War accoutrements and equipment that he donated to the museum. And so once again, his legacy is important in the state capitol because of his role in the Civil War.
Let's turn to Major General James Shields, who had a storied history. He was born in Ireland, and he served as a U.S. Senator from 3 different states. What are some other highlights of his career?
Yeah, his statue was placed here, the last of the 4 statues, in 1914. And his claim to Minnesota's fame is he was our first U.S. Senator along with Henry Rice. So at that time, you have to remember, those senators were elected from the legislative bodies in state houses or state capitals. And so he was not the favorite candidate, but they couldn't decide. They didn't get enough votes to swing one candidate above the other. And so they brought him as kind of a dark horse candidate, a kind of a compromise candidate, and became our first senator. He only served for about a year. And then he was active all over the place. So he, before he came to Minnesota, was a Supreme Court justice in Illinois, was their state auditor.
And didn't he challenge Abraham Lincoln to a duel? And what's the story behind that?
Yeah, in 1842, this young up-and-coming legislator from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, was, and they think Mary Todd might have also had a role in that. They were writing scathing editorials in the newspaper in Springfield, besmirching the credibility and the ability of James Shields. And so Shields wanted to have the satisfaction of knowing who was sending these editorials in the paper, and he eventually finds out it was Abraham Lincoln. So he challenged Abraham Lincoln to a duel. And because Lincoln was challenged, he got to choose his weapons, and the weapon was broadswords. And so they actually went to Missouri, because they couldn't duel legally in Illinois, to fight this duel. And at the last minute, the second stepped in and canceled that duel. So,
and then they became friends, correct?
They had, I don't know if they were like come on over for supper kind of friends, but they had a professional respect and a mutual respect after that time.
You mentioned that Cass Gilbert had designed these niches to be used for state senators or other people of state importance, and yet they were filled with Civil War heroes. Would he have approved of that? Yeah,
he was alive when this took place, and I haven't seen a lot of information or letters he was saying that's the worst idea ever, but I think he had envisioned something different than what we have. But once again, it gives you the idea of the importance of the Civil War when this building opened. This is only 1 decade removed from when this building opened that these statues were all placed here. And so once again, it's really us being able to tell that story of what this building was about. Not only are the laws made here, but you have this important part of our story of Minnesota's involvement in the Civil War throughout the entire state capitol building.
Join us again next week as we delve into more topics affecting Minnesotans. I'm Shannon Loehrke, and on behalf of all of us at Senate Media Services, thanks for watching.